No comment about.
So, I'm going to give you some of the overarching themes of my book, Extreme Cities, tonight. As I was preparing to come here from my home on the other side of the country, the first thing that happened when I woke up this morning was that my 3-year-old daughter demanded, as she always does, that I read her a story. And just so happens that on a trip to the library the previous day, we picked up a copy of Dr. Seuss's classic book, The Lorax. So the first book that I read this morning was The Lorax. I don't know how many of you have read that classic work of conservation, but as I read through it, I started thinking uncontrollably about the event which I was coming to speak at, which I'm speaking at now, and about the kind of gulf that separates us from the time in which Dr. Seuss was writing. If you don't recall, the basic storyline of the Lorax is that a kind of evil capitalist figure called the Onceler comes to a beautiful place with lovely multicolored trees and begins chopping them down to make useless stuff which he markets to people. And in doing that, he displaces the local inhabitants, the barbaloots, who are sort of vaguely bear-looking creatures, the swomy swans, and the humming fish, and they all leave. And each time that they are, these different animals are being displaced, the Lorax, this kind of guardian figure of the area, appears and says to the Onceler, "You've got to stop doing this, otherwise everyone is going to leave." And eventually, since the Onceler doesn't listen to him and keeps producing this useless stuff in order to make more and more buckets of money, the Lorax himself picks himself up by his breeches and transports himself through a hole in the smoggy clouds which have come to cover the area. And so everyone goes to different pastures. And it occurred to me that we live in such a different time because back when the Lorax was written, it was possible to imagine environmental catastrophe as something that was relatively localized, right? You know, the Lorax's forest gets chopped down and all the animals get displaced somewhere else, and eventually the Lorax goes somewhere else too. Today, of course, the environmental crisis is global, and while it manifests with more intensity in one place or another, nonetheless, what we're really contemplating is planetary ecocide. So we can no longer imagine the idea of just picking ourselves up by our britches and jetting through some hole in the clouds to a better place. And that is quite terrifying, obviously. What I argue in my book is that the places in which the greatest numbers of people are concentrated and the greatest percentage of natural disasters strike home are cities, and particularly megacities in the global south, as well as large cities in the global north, so that the city itself becomes a kind of ground zero for climate change. And I'm going to go into some of the specific characteristics of those cities. So that's the specific local ground. It's a planetary emergency, and it's easy to give into a kind of apocalypticism. But I think we need to be careful. We need to acknowledge the challenges which we're confronted with without giving into complete catastrophic feelings, because there's a danger that that kind of catastrophism can be used, particularly by right-wing forces. It can be turned towards a kind of Malthusian xenophobia. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is to present you with some of the really very upsetting information about the way in which cities are a particularly important site where climate change is playing out, and then also talk to you about some of the things that are being done on urban terrain to try and cope with this reality. So I'll start out with some of the very upsetting information. This is a report that was released only a couple of weeks ago about extreme changes that are going on in Antarctica. As you will know, Antarctica and Greenland are the two places where really significant glaciers are based in land. The Arctic, which is melting very fast, of course, is melting into seawater, and consequently the disappearance of Arctic ice is not producing an increase in sea level. In Antarctica and in Greenland, the glaciers are melting and flowing directly off the land masses and into surrounding seas. And so what recent scientific analysis is suggesting is that the projections by bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for expected rates of sea level rise are definitely lowball, right? So the IPCC was projecting up to 6 feet by the end of this century. It looks like we're going to get a lot more, according to this report, and that it's not going to be in some kind of even uptick, but rather in very quick increases of melting followed by plateaus. And as more and more energy is pumped into the atmosphere as a result of global warming, the likelihood that these higher seas are going to produce intense forms of flooding in cities is increased. In fact, last fall, in the middle of the devastating hurricane season in the Western Hemisphere, and right before the meeting of the United Nations Climate Summit in Bonn in Germany, the Guardian newspaper produced a report analyzing projections for the impact of sea level rise on major cities around the world. And the interesting and alarming thing about the report was it was saying this is what we've got happening if we were going to stick to the amount of agreed upon emissions at Paris 2 years before. The thing was, as came out in the course of last fall's UN meeting, the major industrialized powers of the world are far overshooting their promises 2 years ago. So what the Guardian report was highlighting is actually, again, kind of lowballing things. But let's just stick with what the Guardian mentioned. I hope you can read this. It says, hundreds of millions of urban dwellers around the world face their cities being inundated by rising seawaters. That's roughly about 500 million people in major cities, and they list some of the cities, including Shanghai, Alexandria, et cetera, and of course, Miami and New Orleans. In fact, as they say in that middle paragraph, the bottom third of Florida is likely to be inundated by 2100, and of course, inundation is already happening around Miami right now. It's not that we have to wait until 2100 for all of these things to happen. And the other part of the report, which you can see in that final paragraph that was, I think, very important, was the suggestion that many cities are really very, very unprepared and little is being done. What I'm going to talk about in a little while is the kinds of steps that have been taken and what the kind of cutting-edge efforts to think about adaptation in cities are. But first, before I talk about that, I want to talk about the ways in which, in addition to being victims of climate change, cities are also perpetrators of climate change. Cities are responsible for about 70% of carbon emissions, globally speaking. That has to do, of course, with the impact of the built fabric, transportation in the cities, industry in cities, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it's quite hard to see this since carbon emissions are relatively invisible. So how do we make the role of cities apparent? Well, during the Bloomberg administration, there was an interesting attempt to visualize the impact of New York City through the creation of these computer images in which 1 ton of carbon emissions generated by the city would be visualized through a 33-foot diameter balloon. And so here you can see a New York City street with some of these balloons rising up into the atmosphere. To give you a bit of a sense of how this is impacting the planet, here's 1 hour of New York City's carbon emissions stacked up next to the Empire State Building. You can see it's about half the size of the Empire State Building. And of course, it's in a pyramid shape. Pretty dramatic, but not nearly as dramatic as 1 day of carbon emissions. A truly tremendous amount of emissions. And of course, not all cities emit as much as New York City. New York City is particularly concentrated, and of course, if we were to think beyond the geographical bounds of New York City and start thinking about Wall Street and capitalism and the role of New York in terms of being the center and linchpin of the global capitalist system, maybe we should imagine that pile much higher. But it was an effort at least to think about the culpability of cities. If cities are culpable, and if we know they're going to be very, very hard hit by climate change, why do we keep building in such vulnerable places? This is an article from about 2 years ago from Scientific American, where they somewhat naively ask, why is there continued construction along threatened coastlines when we know that seas are rising? And appropriately enough, they picked Miami Beach as the image that went along with this article. I write in my book about Miami in general, but Miami Beach is one of the most threatened places on the planet. Because of its porous limestone foundation. It means you can't build any kind of a seawall or a barricade to stop the waters coming in. They'll just go underneath. In fact, the city is afflicted at the moment by king tides when, strong rain means that the incursion of salt waters produces these swells of water that come up through the sewers, and you get manholes kind of popping off and water flooding neighborhoods. So these issues are a problem right now, not in some future date like 2100. Well, to answer the question of Scientific American, and of course Scientific American doesn't tackle the question as directly as I would like to see it tackled, I think one has to think about the role of capital and urbanization. So cities are really sites today where the global capitalist system parks its overaccumulated assets, right? Over the last 40 years or so, the dominant trend of capitalism has been towards financialization in the developed parts of the world, but intimately linked to financialization and the forms of speculation that are connected to it has been certain forms of urbanization, right? So building out the urban fabric as a way of parking all of this overaccumulated capital of the 1%. In fact, in cities like New York and no doubt Seattle too, there are many empty luxury apartments sitting there because of the need to keep finding a kind of spatial fix for capital in the city. If you look at a map of the world's most threatened cities, this is one produced a couple of years ago by the OECD. In fact, you can kind of see how the history of capitalism over the last half century maps onto the world's most imperiled cities. And you can see that some of them are in obvious places like New York and Miami and New Orleans, but then a lot of the places with the largest amounts of imperiled economic assets are in East Asia, which of course is where capital in the developed world has outsourced labor. And so it's been the site of the development of a whole slew of megacities along the coastal littoral in China and other parts of East and South Asia. And this is just an image of imperiled economic assets. We could also come up with an image of imperiled human populations, which would very much dovetail with this. Now, if we're thinking about cities, though, and how they're threatened, it's also very important not to think about cities as homogeneous. And there's a tendency not only to ignore cities in terms of their impact in climate change, right? When we think about climate change, we tend to think about kind of the global scale, right? Or else like national contributions. That's how carbon emissions tend to be talked about. We talk about the US contribution to emissions on an annual basis. We seldom talk about cities, so it's really important, some of the efforts to image the responsibility for cities that I already showed you is very, very important. But nonetheless, there's a tendency to think about cities as unified units, even in those efforts to make cities visible. But that's a problem. Cities are not unified at all, of course. And it's enough just to mention galloping economic inequality to be aware of that. Of course, cities are very, very much stratified by income and by race. New York City is a particularly strong example of this because of the way in which capital is very much concentrated in Manhattan, in places like Midtown and the downtown financial center. And then there's a kind of ring of in the outer boroughs and even more distant suburbs of working class people, people of color who are servicing capital and traveling in and out to the urban center. And what I'm showing you right now as I speak is an image of energy consumption that really makes the economic disparities within the city quite visible. So you can see that on the left-hand side, that's Manhattan, with, of course, the big green rectangle being Central Park. And the areas to the right are in the top, Queens, and beneath that, parts of Brooklyn. And the dark red areas and orange areas are the areas with highest energy consumption and consequently highest carbon emissions. So you can see that, not surprisingly, the Midtown financial center and Wall Street are the areas that have the highest energy consumption. But it's not just the kind of gleaming skyscrapers of those financial areas, but also wealthy residential areas like the West Village. So basically the kind of urban 1% are very much responsible for disproportionate economic consumption, energy consumption, and carbon emissions within the city. And this image, I think, very much maps that. Not surprisingly, the image also corresponds fairly closely to areas that are threatened by flooding. And here we have the New York City hurricane evacuation zones. If you remember Hurricane Sandy, you'll remember that the downtown area, the Wall Street area, was flooded, and you can see that from the kind of red circle which surrounds the bottom of Manhattan. But you'll notice that much more of New York City that's red is in the outer boroughs, including most of all southern Brooklyn and eastern Queens, which again are populations that are poor, and predominantly people of color. So the areas of the city that are most threatened are also the areas of the city that consume the least, that produce the least emissions, and that are poorest. And of course, this structure of the city is reflected on a global level, right? The people who are most threatened by climate change are the people who are least responsible for climate change in terms of their emissions per capita today, and then of course historically. These are the people of the global south in general. So, right, the kind of global dynamic of climate change and the social inequality that is reflected in climate change is also apparent within specific cities, even in the global north. And this dynamic was very much apparent when Hurricane Sandy struck. One of the things that was, I think, very important about the response to Hurricane Sandy was that it came 1 year after Occupy Wall Street, which focused so much attention on the 1% and on the economic disparities within New York City. So the response to Hurricane Sandy in the form of Occupy Sandy, which I write about in the book, was a kind of grassroots, horizontalist, community-led effort, very much tried to put resources into areas of the city, those areas that you saw previously that were the poorest and that had not been supported by both urban authorities historically, but also by FEMA and other disaster response units when Hurricane Sandy hit. So it's very important to talk about efforts to challenge the ways in which disaster relief tends to play out on an uneven urban terrain and often to reinscribe those inequalities, right, by trying to restore a situation back to the way it was prior to a disaster, even though that situation was one of marked inequality and environmental injustice. And of course, that same kind of dynamic is playing out in Puerto Rico most clamorously today as another hurricane season begins and power continues to go out across the island of Puerto Rico. In the book, I talk about the ways in which New York responded to Sandy through quite novel efforts to adapt the city to forthcoming catastrophes. One of the examples that I talk about was the Rebuild by Design competition. This was an effort to bring together teams of landscape architects, urban planners, engineers, and even sociologists and anthropologists to look at the communities that had been most adversely impacted by Hurricane Sandy, to go into them to find out what people wanted, and to come up with proposals for how to adapt those areas to future impacts of climate change similar to Hurricane Sandy. The design, there were 5 major award-winning designs as part of the competition. There were many other proposals, and you can go on the Rebuild by Design website if you're interested in looking at the whole suite of proposals. I talk about the 5 major award-winning proposals. The one that got the most money was called the Big U. The reason for that name is fairly apparent. If you look at the proposal, it's essentially the idea was to create a kind of berm or seawall or dike or whatever you want to call it, some kind of a breakwater that is in a U shape from West 42nd Street all the way down around Battery Park, which you see in the bottom of the image here, and then back up the east side to 42nd Street. Pretty evidently just to prevent a storm surge along the lines of Hurricane Sandy from inundating the bottom part of Manhattan again. Now, there's a lot of community feedback, particularly from communities which had been ignored during the previous disaster reconstruction effort after 9/11. Following the attacks that demolished the World Trade Centers, a lot of federal and city funding had gone into the downtown, but it had pretty much completely ignored working class neighborhoods, particularly Chinatown and the Lower East Side, which are predominantly populated by people of color. So the community mobilization that resulted from that history meant that when the Rebuild by Design teams began thinking about what to design, they had a very militant community response saying there has to be some element of community support and input into your design. And you can see that here. The seawall was essentially made wide enough that it could become a park and a series of other kind of recreational facilities for communities that are very much starved of access to green space. And this might sound like a relatively unimportant thing. Seattle is a very green city, so I'm sure you have parks all over the place. But in a place like the Lower East Side, getting access to a park is hugely important, particularly since these areas are also places where people have extremely high rates of asthma. So, having green space is extremely important on a very immediate corporeal level. One of the other proposals that I think is particularly interesting, which was part of the award-winning designs for Rebuild by Design, was the Living Breakwaters proposal by Scape Studio. This was for Staten Island, for the East Coast, which got inundated and quite a few people died. I had students, because I teach at the College of Staten Island, whose families were displaced after communities along the seaboard were flooded. What the Living Breakwaters proposal did that was particularly interesting was that instead of saying we're just going to create a seawall, they proposed breakwaters. Why is a breakwater preferable to a seawall? The problem with a seawall is that it tends to only be a certain height, and as I showed you at the beginning of my presentation, tides are rising all the time. So you can inadvertently give people a feeling of safety. They'll build right behind a seawall, and then it can be overtopped. It can fail catastrophically. And of course, from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, we know what the implications of one of those kinds of failures are. So a breakwater doesn't try to keep the water out entirely. It just tries to cut the strength of the storm surge and make people aware that it might be coming, but prevent it from being quite as catastrophic as it might otherwise be. The other 2 elements of the proposal that I think are particularly interesting and forward-thinking, one of them includes making a kind of multi-species site of habitation for the breakwaters. So instead of it just being a kind of concrete breakwater, Scape Studio proposes creating oyster habitat on the breakwater, and the idea is to create a kind of oyster reef that will grow as the waters themselves get higher, and the oyster beds will act as part of the breakwater. And in addition to that, the oysters will hopefully be part of a vibrant sea based community of humans interacting with the oysters. So the proposal included local hubs for connecting people to knowledge about the aquatic environment, and also, of course, for trying to get people to harvest and to tend to the living breakwaters as a site of education and also potentially economic vitalization for coastal communities. So I think there's a real recognition of the ways in which human beings have to live in relation to these protective infrastructures, and the way in which these infrastructures have to include a living component and to kind of incorporate nature rather than just being about engineering. So I think that's what marks these pretty interesting innovations. However, there are quite significant limits to them, and I think those become apparent when one begins to look at really grassroots up proposals for adaptation. And in the book I talk about the proposal from We Act, which is a Harlem-based environmental justice organization, which proposed a plan for northern Manhattan, which is quite multifaceted. You can go on the web and read about it in more detail. I'm just going to highlight very quickly 3 different elements of it. One had to do with community-based power. So in both senses of the term of power, right? So part of it is to create solar-powered microgrids, and this is going to add to resilience of the community. One of the things which I'm sure you will remember, when Hurricane Sandy struck Manhattan, it inundated a breaker system and knocked out generation for pretty much all of Manhattan south of about 30th Street. So for a week or two, there was no power in much of downtown, and there were these dramatic images of New York lit up with all of its lights at night and just complete darkness south of 30th Street. So it's very important to have this community-based microgrid so that if the rest of the grid crashes, people will be able to have power. And this is particularly important in a city like New York, which has people living in quite high buildings, because our famous Catskills-based water supply only goes up to the 5th floor based on natural pressure. Above the 5th floor, if you don't have electricity, you don't have any water. So not only is it a case when the electricity goes out that you might not have heat, your elevators might not be working, but also you won't have any water. It becomes a real life and death issue, particularly for vulnerable populations. So this is one really important element of the We Act proposal. And in addition to having power in the kind of electrical sense of the term, the microgrid is also going to be able to put power back into the rest of the grid, and by doing that, generate economic resources for the community. And of course, with the need to maintain the microgrid, well-paying jobs and employment in the community, right? So it's power in a quite developed sense of the term. One of the other elements of the proposal has to do with dealing with the heat island effect. I've been talking a lot about flooding and inundation, but the thing that kills the most people in cities, and probably will continue to do so in the future as climate change bites deeper, is heat problems in cities and the kind of combination of heat and bad air. So in order to cope with that, we really need to green cities as much as possible. We Act proposes creating community gardens, which would help to green the city, but which would also deal to a certain extent with the problem of food deserts in working class and communities of color, where there aren't good grocery stores in many cases, and would also, again, provide a source of revenue for local communities. And then the final element of their proposal, which I'd like to highlight, is the idea of social centers or social hubs, right? Because one of the things that we've come to understand by studying disasters in cities is that the difference between life and death often has to do with whether you know your neighbors. In other words, it has to do with the thickness of your social networks. This is really important because when you start to hear people talking about resiliency, the conversation is often dominated by engineers and other people who are thinking about resiliency in terms of the infrastructure. You know, is the electrical system going to crash when the temperature goes above a certain level? That's all very, very important, but it's really, really crucial to think about how to maintain social contacts and to strengthen those kinds of contacts. So what We Act proposes is these social centers which people could repair to, which they could take refuge in during a natural disaster, so that these would be places that would have solar panels that would be able to keep electricity going if the grid crashed, that would be in an elevated area, so that they would be very important during a time of natural disaster, but they'd also be open to the communities year-round. So on a kind of quotidian basis, they could become a site for building community and the kind of thick social fabric that we've come to learn is absolutely essential to survival. And that sort of takes me back to what I was saying about Occupy Sandy, right, and the way that they used sort of horizontalist networks. When FEMA and the city government weren't available, it was communities engaging in mutual aid that really helped people survive. These are all really, really important examples of kind of cutting-edge adaptation to climate change in cities. And we could go through many examples in other cities and think about the ways in which cities in the global south, for instance, have very developed social networks, even if they don't have some of the developed infrastructure. So they often get seen as sites of particular disaster from a kind of biased perspective in the global north in a way that is not necessarily true. But I think in addition to thinking about adaptation, we also have to admit the need for retreat. As I said, by the end of the century, most of the world's major cities are going to be flooded, and some portions of those cities are going to have to be abandoned, either partially for some time or permanently. And in some cases, cities like New Orleans and Miami, as inconceivable as it might be today, those cities are going to have to be evacuated totally. So how do we confront questions of retreat and ensure that it's not just the wealthy 1% who can afford to abandon property or to sell it and move to other properties which they have the economic means to access? These are questions which really aren't discussed very much in the public sphere in the US today. We have a kind of macho imperialist discourse of, building it back and these colors won't run. And, beginning to talk about these things is very, very hard, both because of kind of public discourse, but also because of some of the structures through which we operate, right? We have, for instance, a national flood insurance program which pays people to rebuild their houses rather than to actually move them to other places. It was originally designed to help people move away from threatened places, but the way it operates today is essentially to subsidize the most wealthy to rebuild their second or third houses. So there's also a kind of institutional crisis and contradiction that we need to confront. So where are these kinds of conversations about just retreat happening? Well, they're beginning to filter through to some design and urban planning circles. As I was thinking about these questions, I came across a report by the Urban Land Institute about northern Miami, which, as I said earlier, is one of the world's most threatened cities. So they talk about a portion of the city which is repeatedly flooded. They talk about the way in which development in the 20th century took place completely irregardless of the natural landscape, so that houses were built in areas where the topography was quite low-lying, where there were underground aquifers, and consequently where flooding was going to become more and more of a problem. So the Urban Land Institute confronts that question and says, what can we do? Well, what we should do is to buy out repeatedly flooded properties and create some kind of a parkland. They use a kind of endearingly anachronistic term, a slough or slough, which any of you who've read Pilgrim's Progress from the 18th century, that's sort of where the sinner ended up. But they don't mean it that way. They mean it kind of as a place that can be a public amenity, a park, when it's not raining heavily or flooding, and then when the floods come, water will collect there, and it will not harm homes or people as a result. Of course, the big question is, where will the people who live there now go? Well, Urban Land Institute proposes, and I'm sorry, you probably can't read very much of this because of how far away from you it is, but they propose offering residents of these areas first dibs on affordable housing built further inland along the kind of elevated spine of land that goes down the center of the Florida peninsula. So affordable housing that is going to be developed in a way that means that it will be relatively light in terms of its carbon emissions, connected to a transit line, a public transit line down the center of the peninsula. This is still a proposal. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. The Urban Land Institute has a problematic history, though. After Hurricane Katrina, they worked with the Bring New Orleans Back Commission to propose similar kinds of schemes for New Orleans. Basically, as you can see here, those kind of green circles, they proposed creating these kind of sloughs or parks that could absorb floodwaters if the levees burst again. But what they proposed back after Katrina was that the people living in those areas be dispossessed by giving the city right to eminent domain so that people's houses could just be taken away. And this raised a real hue and cry. People saw it as an extension of racist policies that have dominated the city of New Orleans for many, many decades. And so the proposal was eventually stepped away from by Mayor Nagin, which was a huge victory for struggles of communities of color in the city on one level, but on another level, there are people living in areas that are likely to be flooded once again in the not too distant future. So we also have to really think about these conversations about just retreat and about environmental justice much more deeply and through much deeper forms of consultation with threatened communities if we're not going to have this kind of thing, imagining the rebuilt city in terms of greening the wealthy financial districts and doing it with a kind of white male hand rather than through any kind of forms of environmental justice. The last thing that I want to talk about, in addition to issues of adaptation and retreat, is to go back to mitigation. I mean, for a long time, it was taboo to even talk about adaptation, right? Because we wanted to only think about mitigation and how we diminish carbon emissions. The argument of my book is that we can't talk about that alone anymore. But I want to close by saying that we do have to think about cities as crucibles of the struggle for mitigation, and that they are, in fact, proving to be sites for thinking about just transition and sites for struggle against fossil capital specifically. In the New York region, this is particularly important. You can see here a map of pipelines. And of course, not too far away from New York City is the Marcellus Shale, which is the site of the greatest expansion of fracking that's going on in the United States today. And you can see the number of pipelines in the left-hand side there really gives you a sense of the extent of fracking and new infrastructure for so-called natural gas, which is actually methane. But then you can see some of the pipelines that are moving all of that east towards urban areas like Philadelphia and New York, and then, of course, beyond onto transfer terminals and boats heading for the European Union. So there's a real struggle going on right now in the New York region to stop this fossil fuel infrastructure, because, of course, we know that we can have no new fossil fuel infrastructure if we're going to prevent catastrophic climate change. We have to shut down all the existing coal mines and a lot of the existing oil and natural gas mines if we are going to avoid catastrophic climate change. And we certainly can have more of this stuff. So we really have a huge fight on our hands. New York City, I'm very pleased, as you probably know, has actually had quite a signal victory recently with the announcement back in January by Mayor Bill de Blasio that the city would be divesting its pension funds from fossil fuels and suing the top 5 big oil corporations. And of course, the mayor's announcement came after many years of really militant struggle by environmental justice organizations, housing rights organizations, and many other groups, including labor on the ground in New York City. And it's a signal victory, but of course we need to think about how to push this victory further, because divestment is going to take some time, and we really don't have much time. So what's happening in New York, the kind of cutting edge of this struggle, is being advanced by this coalition called New York Renews, which is composed of some of the same groups that were behind divestment. So it's a real kind of coalitional effort. And there are two major prongs which we're fighting to push right now through the New York State legislature. One is this Climate and Community Protection Act, which, as you can see, is very much a move to mandate that the city move towards completely carbon-free economy very quickly by 2050 at the latest. Although you'll see that there's also earmarking of 40% of the funds for communities that are disadvantaged in various different ways. And that sort of middle element is developed in much more detail by the second major legislative initiative which New York Renews Coalition is pushing, and that's the Polluter Pays bill, which you can see here about a third of the revenue is for creating climate jobs and new renewable energy infrastructure. A third is for a just transition fund that's completely targeted to disadvantaged communities. And then another third is for a rebate fund so that the big oil companies can't just pass the costs of the tax on to poor people and working class people. And then the final section, which is the second from the right column, is 7% of revenue devoted to people working in fossil fuel jobs right now, right? We need to bring those communities along, and that's particularly important in moving labor, which in New York State is very, very important to support this drive. So I think this is really the cutting edge and is being advanced by some of the same organizations that are pushing very forward-thinking adaptation and just transition conversations. I'll close with this slide from the Empire State Building. It was lit up green the day after Mayor Bill de Blasio's announcement of divestment, and I think it holds out the hope that cities, in addition to being drivers of climate change and victims of climate change, can also be sites where the struggle for social justice and environmental justice and for the future takes place. Thanks very much, everyone. So I'd love to hear your questions. If folks would like to, I could take multiple questions. I think like maybe 3 would probably make sense at a time if we can get together that many. And so please let me know what you'd like to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say if people wouldn't mind using the microphones, we are doing a couple different recordings. In order to catch your question, we just need it through the mic. So there's one here and then there's one across the way.
Thank you very much for a unfortunately very depressing but invigorating talk. As I know you're always involved in that kind of dichotomy there, for what you do. But I thought it was it's very interesting, and but I would like to ask you if see what you think of this scenario. Is that the cutting edge solutions that you are you referred to in your talk, are generally speaking market-based solutions. And you talked about fossil capital, which the concern I have there is that it sort of suggests that, well, maybe there's a green capital that would be, our way to salvation. And I would suggest that market solutions are doomed in this scenario. First, because capital has an imperative to grow, and even if there's energy is coming from renewable sources, capital is still going to go full speed ahead to deplete the resources of our society, of our planet, in order to accumulate more and more capital. And the other point is that the solutions that you pointed out, for example, of retreat. These are the people who are being asked to go to affordable housing will presumably be displaced by eminent domain. They will be given a certain amount of money, perhaps for that loss, and be asked to move to affordable housing. Housing for a situation that they had nothing to do with for the most part, and they're going to have to foot the bill. And so it seems to me the only solution that we have is some sort of planned economy where we try to figure out what's the best way to proceed here that we can actually salvage our race and the species on the planet. And I'd like to leave my comments with two words to see if that, to emphasize the point, and those two words are Scott Pruitt.
Okay. Should we take a couple of questions? Yeah, I don't know how much time we have in the hall, but I'd like to be able to get as many people would like to ask questions. So, yeah.
Okay, so last week I read a part of an interview with a scientist in the UK who has predicted kind of the path that we're taking. And he suggests that actually by 2100, it's questionable whether we'll be able to support humanity with what's left of the planet. Okay, and he posits a couple of things that I think are very interesting. He says, if you want to impact climate, you stop having kids. Okay, he says that's the biggest driver of global warming that's not talked about, population growth. He says actually we need to have a negative population growth, and he doesn't see this happening anytime soon, even by 2100. And this is a practical question for me, okay? Do I devote, I'm retired, I'm a senior, I've spent all my life in the struggle for social justice, against war. Do I spend the next 20 years of my life fighting for something that's not attainable using these methods when the methods that we're going to need to reverse this are really outside of our current economy and even our current consciousness? Mm-hmm. I don't know that. I know that in the highly developed capitalist countries, the birth rate is lower than in some other parts of the world. But if we're going to get to a negative population growth, I can think of two things. Genocide, okay, or some really radical change in the way, not just our thinking, but how we're prepared to live our lives to achieve those massive drops in carbon emissions.
Right. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, great.
So I know you know this problem, and I won't be telling you anything that you won't know. But whenever a sentence begins, we need to confront the problem. The initial problem before the problem is the problem of we. And by we, I mean, I guess Jody Dean might have put it best by saying the rest of us. Because the 1% don't belong to the we. The 1% are attached to the accumulation of capital as it will continue. Yeah. And I think it's very interesting if you look at the parallel problem that you brought up in the beginning about the overaccumulation of capital and parking it in the central cities now, where it goes, some of which are going to be inundated, but most of the people with capital are going to find ways to take the Malthusian solution that they are going to propose and present it as some sort of ecologically sound conclusion, as Jeff Mann points out. There's a lifeboat, we're going to have to put people outside it, and guess what? It's going to be the people in the outer boroughs, you know? Right. But I don't know how to change the terms of the discussion so social conflict can be forefronted in it. But when we discuss the problem in Seattle now of rising rents and the displacement of people being displaced not by a natural disaster, but something that is treated as a natural disaster. The fact that all this overaccumulated capital is seeking real estate in all the cities of the world and is driving up everything, and yet the discussion is still presented on the notion of a question of supply and demands. It's the people who are pushing for zoning who are really holding it back, and if you upzone and let developers build what they have, it's bound to produce so much more available space that the rents are going to come down and everything will be all right. At the same time, there are newspaper articles every day in Seattle that say, you won't be able to live in Seattle when you retire, but here are some nice places like Cleveland you can move to that you can afford. In other words, a whole population is being told, you know what, get ready to leave. You know, be resilient, you know, and let these wealthier people who have been paid more come in and enjoy the city that you thought was your home for 40 years. So, I mean, this is the same as the displacement issue that the people didn't want to go in New Orleans, but the key initial issue is how do we subtract the 1% from the we and then get the other we, the rest of us, to put conflict at the center of what we're proposing. That's the...
Okay, great. Thank you. Great questions. Well, you know, mobilizing people and making the struggles clear is, you know, what I'm really trying to do in the book. There is a section basically at the very outset of the book where I talk about Bloomberg's New York. You know, we'd had horribly kind of neo-fascist mayors like Rudy Giuliani, you know, quality of life, you know, mayor who really took homeless people off the streets violently during his reign. And so for some people, Bloomberg was a welcome relief. You know, he promoted himself as this kind of technocratic, super efficient person who was bringing all of the skills of business into public administration. But what I do in the book is to show the fundamental irrationality of capitalism, so that about a third of New York City was rezoned during Bloomberg's regime. While he was talking about greening the city, you know, and he did do genuinely important things. He planted 1 million trees, which is important. You know, he made bicycle lanes. Great, we can all be for bicycle lanes, but building bicycle lanes and rezoning the city, so all of it in coastline areas that are in those flood zones that you saw in the one map that I showed, is kind of like an inconvenient truth where you hear about this disaster and at the end of the film you're told, well, you can just change your light bulbs, right? So, you know, the kind of fundamental contradiction there of talking a green game and developing the city in a way that put huge numbers of people in threat, and also engaged in galloping gentrification, because I show how the affordable housing which Bloomberg built was not really affordable. It was pegged to median income in the city, and so you know, working class people just couldn't afford it, particularly working class people in the very communities where it was being built, like Long Island City and Williamsburg and other places which have been at the center of development. So the book really tries to show how capitalism is developing in completely contradictory ways and creating these imperiled cities, these kind of extreme cities, cities which are extreme economically, but which are also in sites that make them targets of the forms of extreme weather which climate change is creating. So to the first gentleman who asked about market-based solutions, a lot of the book is really showing how those kinds of market-based solutions are really part of kind of greenwashing. You know, they're a strategy that is completely contradictory and puts people in the path of disaster, both quotidian and, you know, the so-called natural disasters like Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Maria. As to what you said about market-based solutions in some of the things I presented, I think the situation is a little bit complex. I mean, I'm very critical of the Rebuild by Design initiative and the way, you know, the limitations of some of the proposals for development. But I also want to show how there's been a long history of mobilization in New York City from grassroots communities, so that some of the rebuild by design proposals, which came from a combination of foundation money, the Rockefeller Foundation, and HUD, right, the federal agency, really were changed, right? So you had these big architectural firms, engineers, et cetera, really working at the behest of a state agency and a big foundation. And, I know that Rockefeller Foundation has all kinds of problems. It comes from big oil, and it is responsible for the green revolution in the third world, which is, fossil-based agriculture, one of the main things we need to confront today. However, you can really see the pushback there. So I think we need to think kind of carefully, and I wouldn't say those are just purely market-based solutions. I would say they're kind of mixed solutions with a kind of mix of somewhat utopian elements and highly problematic elements. What I showed you in terms of the We Act proposal, I think, is very much more grassroots, and it's not at all market-based. In fact, one of the elements, which I didn't really have time to go over, is the effort to think about ways of taking land off the market, right, in the We Act proposal through various different measures in order to create public housing to protect what exists in New York, which is really significant, and to find new ways to socialize housing. So I think that's all really important. In terms of the just transition question, you're right, it's a really, really hard, vexing question, and there's a horrible history there of people being forcibly displaced. And, we can go back 500 years. This is a settler colonial culture, and we have a history of taking people off their land and, marching them in a kind of genocidal push into other places. And what's happening in terms of cities today is just a continuation of that. In the book, though, I do want to grapple with the fact that people are going to have to move. So how do we develop mechanisms that can give people some kind of a voice? And I look at some proposals from indigenous communities in Alaska, like Shishmaref, and anthropologists who've been working with those communities to find ways to put pressure on Alaska State, on the federal government, and on the Bureau of Indian Affairs to give communities a real, genuine say over where they move, how they move, when they move, what the economic resources to support that move will be. So I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations, as hard and painful as they may be, and as problematic as the history may be, because if progressives don't talk about this, it's going to be the right wing that dominates the conversation, kind of de facto. At least that's the argument I make. In terms of the second question about population growth, well, first of all, urbanization, which is happening, the predominant amount of it is in the global south, is one of the main ways that population numbers go down. But I would say that the argument around population is something that we really, really need to resist strongly. It's a kind of Malthusian argument. The left, I think, has a history of resisting it for very good reasons, of insisting that it's about the distribution of resources rather than a sheer quantity of people, right? I mean, think about the fact that 6 billionaires have as many economic assets as the bottom half of world population. If we could just take their resources and give it to the rest of the world, it wouldn't be a problem to support them wherever they chose to live. And I think these kinds of arguments are particularly important to resist because, as I said at the very, very outset, there's a way in which our kind of increasingly catastrophic times can be kind of played on by a kind of green neo-fascism. That's not so much part of the discourse, my sense, in the US at the moment, because we have a climate change denier in control of the federal government. But if you go to places like Phoenix and Arizona, it is part of the conversation. You have right-wing groups saying that this land only has a certain carrying capacity, and that's why we have to get rid of immigrants, right? So the kind of right-wing discourse is very much emergent there. And if we look at the European Union, we can see groups like the AfD, the neo-fascist party in Germany, which is bringing a version of Nazism back to Germany, making these kinds of Malthusian arguments. So I think we need to talk about reparations for climate change, the fact that people in the global north have developed and have a quality of living that has been based on a history of colonial exploitation and uneven development, that it's the global north that's responsible disproportionately for climate change, both historically and in terms of current per capita capita emissions, and that we have a responsibility to give harbor to climate refugees, first and foremost, in our cities, and of course, also to give the economic resources to global South societies so that they can make a fast, just transition to renewable energy. And the international community has agreed to those kinds of things. As neoliberal as the UN climate talks have been, there is a global green kind of climate fund. It's just hardly any money, significant money has been put into it, right? So we really need to have a big push around these kinds of arguments. And absolutely, in terms of what you're saying, Philip, it has to come from a real eco-socialist perspective and a very strong movement. And this book of mine comes out of the inspiration that I gleaned by going to the UN climate summits. I never actually got into any of the official venues because, I'm not affiliated with anything other than a humble public university. But I was at the climate summits, and there were these amazing mobilizations outside in counter summits by global civil society, where I met folks like the indigenous environmental group and trash pickers from Mumbai, and many other civil society organizations who are making the kinds of arguments about climate justice, reparations that I've been trying to air in my book. So I think there's a very strong movement internationally, but we also are in a period of kind of neo-fascism around the world, or rising neo-fascism. So I think we really are, again, kind of faced with that question of socialism or barbarism, and we have to fight very hard to make sure things don't go in a very, very dangerous direction as climate change makes the situation more and more precarious for people around the world. Okay, that was a series of really interesting questions. Shall we break and I can sign books, or would anybody else like to ask one last kind of burning question? Yes, okay.
So I lived in Seattle all my life, and they had a really great public transportation system back when I was a kid. And there were trolleys, and you didn't have to wait very long for a bus. And I have an electric bicycle, and most of these events, I can just ride my bike to. This one was a little bit farther away, but it's not just because of the energy savings and all that. What it really is it's getting to the point where driving is totally pointless. Yeah. And I'm really serious. And I could get, to most of these places at that time of the day faster on my bike, and I live quite a ways away from them. This was too far, but, than I could driving my car at 5 o'clock, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, it makes me wonder when that's going to dawn on people, that it's pointless to drive. And not only that, with all the displacement and everything, it just means people have to drive farther. And all those cars are just sitting there burning gas and pouring carbon into the atmosphere. So we have a very, supposedly the greenest governor, and we have a nominally progressive city council and mayor and everything. But I think we're kind of behind if you compare us to, other places like Northern Europe and stuff, what they're doing to get people out of their cars. Mm-hmm. So did you look into this a little bit?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. Before I answer that question, any other questions? Or should we call it a night with a response to that question? Okay, a couple more. All right, we'll take these two more. Yes.
Yeah, I just, listening to these things, I hear they're pretty substantial, right? Like some of the ones in New York, they're not going to happen like in a year, right? They're probably talking a decade, or it feels to me a lot like kind of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It seems like we need something larger than that, like you're saying about some kind of entire country change or change, and so I have trouble focusing on these things when it's like, well, yeah, but ocean acidification is going to kill off these things. When I talk about oysters, I'm like, I don't know if there'll be oysters and that can survive there.
I bring that up actually in the book.
Yeah, so things like that just make me wonder. And I guess the other thing is, the places that aren't doing it right are already leading to conflict. So there's a question of, yeah, we can talk about rebuilding cities and stuff, but if we're blowing each other up, what does it matter? Like, it's hard for me to keep hopeful, I guess, without some really dramatic changes instead of little city here kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
I was going to piggyback on the transportation question, and specifically, there's kind of a idea in the book that we shouldn't be rushing into places like Seattle and New York, where there's a lot of affordability issues and just generally like how do you fit more people in these places. But at the same time, there's a limited amount of American cities with good transit. So how do you decrease emissions in a kind of auto-based country that I think of like Nashville, who earlier this month declined to invest in their transit system, and it failed spectacularly. How do you? Is it like small cities needing to improve their transit, or is there kind of an imperative to grow up in places that are passively, transit friendly?
Okay, great. Thank you for those questions. They're very important ones. I think it's really important that the left makes arguments that offer people a hopeful future, and so they can't be purely arguments based on downsizing or abstention or sort of finger wagging moralism about the amount of consumption that people engage in. We need to be able to admit that the U.S. is a product of 50 years of petroculture. That the reason we don't have trams is because the big auto companies and oil companies connived to have them all ripped up and destroyed in the 1950s, and spent a huge amount of time advertising the benefits of suburbia to white middle-income Americans and subsidizing that through subsidized mortgages in the GI Bill, something that of course didn't extend to everybody in the population, and even those who benefited, it broke down along gender lines in a way which for most women was not necessarily a great boon, right? Women who had been in the workforce in World War II were largely sort of pushed back into the house, middle-class women at least. So there were definite losses that were involved in the generation of the American way of life during the American century. And I think we can talk about the ways in which the system that we currently have, including the kind of mental outlook that we have, has not done right, either by all of us in terms of our ability to create vibrant social spaces and in terms of our possibility to live on the planet. Now, how you get your local government to pass progressive policies of transportation, I think that kind of depends on the city and mobilizing coalitions of various different kinds. I mean, my experience really comes from New York, where we're lucky to have a pretty strong public transportation system that didn't get ripped out during the post-war period, but it's also under threat and underfunded and breaking down increasingly. So, it's a huge fight, and it's a kind of political fight that we all have to engage in. I would just say that while the reason not to do these things is often a kind of fiscal reason, like we don't have the money to support public transportation or to remake our entire infrastructure, history shows us that that's not true, right? I mean, if you look back to World War II, which is, many people like Bill McKibben have argued is a kind of example which can be quite useful in terms of thinking of the kind of rapid transition that we need to have. Back in World War II, the auto plants in Detroit were switched from making cars to making bombers in 1 year, right? So we have experience of massive transformation of industrial infrastructures. We can do that, and we need to do that because the current crisis is one of the lack of meaningful and decent employment for the vast majority of people in this country. I mean, we've got lots of employment, but it's bad and poorly paid employment, right? So this goes back to what I was saying about the left should not just be some sort of hair shirt, we need to give up things. We need to make arguments that connect with people in terms of possibility for jobs and for better, more meaningful lives and forms of sociality. And I think that's even more true in global South countries. So the place I come from, South Africa, recently had a plan put forward by labor unions called the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign. The idea was to recognize that South Africa has an economy based on extraction of gold and diamonds. It's failing, so the promise of ending apartheid really has not come through for the vast majority of South Africans, who are economically worse off now than they were before the election of Mandela. Even though, legal apartheid has been dismantled, people are struggling more than ever before. So if you acknowledge that the economic system is not working, what do? Well, you start talking about really shifting the economy completely to renewable energy and all of the jobs that can be produced by that. And so I think we really need to push that, and we need to acknowledge, going back to the first question, that this isn't going to be a market-led transition. I mean, I think one of the big arguments we need to make is that the market is not going to do it, right? Because right now, it seems within the country that climate change denial, which has been funded by big oil, of course, heinously, is our biggest problem. But if you look in more progressive places, or places that have a history of social democracy, even though there's kind of neo-fascism on the move today, like European Union countries, denialism is not an issue, and the same corporations like Shell that have been funding denialism here are already talking about carbon taxes and market-based solutions as the way to go. So I think that the left has to start making much stronger arguments about a kind of state-led transition, a really rapid and massive state-led transition that can be a huge jobs program for people, and really well-paying jobs to boot. And this has to be one that is not led by some top-down state along the lines of social democracy in previous decades, but one that really is driven by social movements. Now, that might sound absolutely impossible to win, but there are places like Britain, for instance, where Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is actually proposing things like this, right? His party is driven by a radical social movement that has transformed it, and he's talking about nationalizing the energy grid in order to completely change it to renewable energy. So, he hasn't won power yet, but he got 40% of the vote last time there was a national election. He's not that far away. And we should remember that Bernie Sanders had similar kinds of ideas in his platform. So, there's, I think, a real sense of possibility in the air, and that we really need to push it forward and have very ambitious proposals for the kind of rapid and relatively utopian transition that we want to see. Okay, I think we should probably wrap things up on that note. Thank you all very much.